And welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us live here from China, Suzhou, CLNB with SMM at this exciting conference. And I'm really excited to have Wolfgang with us to share some insights on the Chinese market.
Hi Simon, it's great to be here, yes.
Yes, and good to see you again. Let's get right into it. Let's get some questions. So maybe if you could just start a bit on an overview of the Chinese market, also from an upstream perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese market is growing significantly, and as we all know, Chinese companies are really dominating the upstream value chain. So there have been a lot of investments in, for example, the nickel industry in Indonesia. More than 90% of all the investment is coming from China. We do see a lot of investments in lithium, not only in the traditional sources in South America or in Australia, where even some of the European or US companies are looking at, but also in Africa. As I've seen here from Ganfeng, for example, also BYD, a couple of others, they invest in Africa and lithium resources. We do see a lot of capacity being built up on the graphite side, maybe too much, yeah, with significant price reductions in the market and already a couple of companies going out. Same is probably true for the cathode materials, both for LFP but also for ternary materials, where the announced capacities are significantly higher, and already the capacities in the market are higher than what's needed, again with significant price decreases. Also on the cell side, I think we had in cell manufacturing, we had an average capacity utilization of only 40%, something like that in China in the last year. And it might even get worse. So too much capacity has been added. That's why the Chinese government added this new regulation or proposed this new regulation to urge Chinese companies to spend at least 3% in R&D, improve efficiency, and don't add capacity without real orders from customers.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the overview. And now we can talk a bit about regulation and also incentives, right? In the West, there's a lot happening in Europe, but also US. So how are they impacting Chinese businesses?
Maybe we start with the US. Obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act and all the measures being implemented by the US administration they have two objectives. Number one is to increase the local value add. Number two is get Chinese companies out. So I would say it's really hard for Chinese companies that do not have significant shareholdings from companies outside China and that do not have do have any connections to the Chinese state to make business in the US. So they are being pushed out. Now with the additional tariffs, it also means much more investments that needs to be done in the US. I don't think it really works in the US, or it will really work with respect to the upstream materials, because there's a certain amount of lithium that you might be able to mine in the US or in other countries that are free trade countries or have a critical minerals agreement. But for example, graphite, now with 25% import tariffs on graphite, that only leads to increasing prices for the American customers of electric vehicles or for the utilities that buy stationary energy storage. And on the other hand, the 25% is also by far not enough to compensate the higher cost that you have, for example, for graphite production, most likely in the US than in China. So that's the US basically closing the market. So the biggest market for exports, but also for investments, is probably Europe now. There are other markets as well, India, for example, that are interesting, but Europe is the biggest one. And we do see quite a lot of investments in Europe, but also in Morocco, that has a free trade agreement with Europe as well.
Great. So then so you say US is kind of out and Europe is booming.
US is kind of out as a target market for Chinese companies. Because of the tariffs and you can still export, yeah, but because of the Inflation Reduction Act, the American OEMs need to look for material and intermediate material and raw material sources that are outside China. and that are ideally in free trade countries. Different story in Europe. In Europe, you have the Critical Minerals Act that requires, or it has set a target of 10% for raw materials to be produced or basically mined in Europe, which is possible for lithium. It's impossible for nickel because there are not that many nickel resources in Europe. And then 40% for refining and cathode materials. From our overviews of what we see in refining projects, what we see in cathode material projects, in general that can be achieved. But if we have a closer look, if we look at the higher share of lithium iron phosphate batteries that we expect in Europe, roughly 40% on the passenger car side, there will be not enough lithium carbonate refining capacity in Europe, at least from the current planning status. And there will be not enough lithium iron phosphate production or LMFP production in Europe. However, you don't necessarily need that. So if currently there is no carrot and no stick. So the only thing that you need to have is, because of the Brexit regulations, you have to have a certain value add in Europe, and that is relevant for ternary materials, for NCM-based batteries that do require basically the cathode material to be produced in Europe, not for LFP. And LFP production in China is much cheaper than LFP production can be in Europe.
So you already mentioned the Critical Minerals Act, but also maybe looking at Europe again from EU battery regulation.
Yes.
Because it's a big framework. And if you could maybe share a bit about how this is impacting also again Chinese companies and how ready are they for the EU battery regulation?
I would say the most important topic or the most important topics are centered around the supply chain transparency. So the requirements to basically be able to trace the requirements coming from the regulation, and then the OEMs that will force their cell suppliers, and they will force the cathode material suppliers to trace everything back down to the mining site to make sure that certain ESG regulations are met, etc. That's one point. And then the second point is with respect to the amount of recycled material that you would need, specifically starting from 2031 with lithium, nickel and cobalt, and then with increased shares in 2036. They can use materials from production scrap, and that it will be the major source for the next 8-9 years. So we think until 2033, 2034, it's a major source. Then you have to use also materials from end-of-life vehicles. Now, how is that impacting? It basically means the cell manufacturers, and I had a couple of discussions, they are required to use those amounts of materials, and it's already in the contracts, sometimes even larger shares than what's required by the regulation. And that results in a kind of competition for the materials. Yeah? The cell manufacturing scrap is typically today sent as black mass to Korea, and then being recycled and then can be brought back. And I think that's still the case. At least currently there's nothing in the regulation that forbids that. But every cell manufacturer actually would probably only be able to use his own manufacturing scrap, and you don't want that much manufacturing scrap. So you have to get additional material from additional sources, and that's a little bit the challenge, I would say.
Great, and thanks for sharing that. And yeah, also maybe if we again look a bit at the US and also the 100% EV tariffs, right, which just came out. Maybe we could share a bit more about how is the existing material used kind of to also offset some of these tariffs for the Chinese market, or also overall, how do you see the impact of these tariffs from the US? You mentioned already on the 25% of graphite, but also EVs overall, maybe for the EV market. How's this impacting the forecast?
I mean, what does it mean? It basically means that the American customers have to pay more, than others. And you have experienced probably the same when you drive here or ride here with Chinese cars. You get a lot of value for your money. Yeah, I mean, I've been in a couple of vehicles that probably where you probably would pay 3 times the amount of money in Europe for the same interior, for the same equipment, for the same amount of options that you would use. So in 100%, it basically means there will not be a lot of vehicles, of Chinese vehicles being imported to the US. They also push out or kind of put pressure on Mexico not to allow production or not to incentivize Chinese EV production in Mexico. That means probably lower adoption because costs of EVs are also a very important topic for the customers that are sitting mainly on the coast. So lower import. Again, I would say more pressure for Chinese companies to export these vehicles to other markets, most likely to Europe again.
Yeah, and that's kind of next, right? Looking at the Chinese companies on their overseas expansion, right? I think there's a lot of plans there. Do you think overall will be a win-win? And what should also Chinese companies do, right, for good partnerships, relationships with the West?
Yeah, let's talk about the two different regions. The US first. I would say a win-win situation is what we already see. These kind of licensing royalty service agreements that have been put in place with the famous Chinese cell manufacturer and now two US OEMs. There are also some that still have plans to build capacity in the US, and they might be able because they are majority owners are not from China. So that's one thing. So basically to share IP, to do some kind of technology transfer and get royalties back. That's one perspective. Another thing that we probably will see is kind of joint ventures for R&D between Chinese companies and Western companies. Not necessarily in the US, but maybe in other places in order to make it less dependent on the regulations. In Europe, we do see a lot of investment plans from Chinese companies, whether it's EV manufacturers like BYD that do have plans to go to Europe, probably a couple of others. We do see all the major, or a couple of the major Chinese cell manufacturers going there, even if one just has cancelled one plan because of the lower expectations. And we do see materials companies going there, whether it's cathode materials companies going to France or precursor materials companies, PCAM companies, whether it's electrolyte companies. So they will invest in Europe, which creates economic value in Europe. They might go in joint ventures, or they will go in joint ventures as well. We will see the first joint venture of a cell manufacturer with an OEM in Europe as well. Not only in the US, also in Europe we will see that. And that's, I would say, the kind of win-win situation. So everybody is making or is gaining economic benefits from that transfer of the probably most advanced economy when it comes to battery and the battery value chain in China here.
Good. And to summarize, kind of what I hear from this is in the US, we potentially see more partnerships, more kind of IP agreements, etc., between companies, and maybe some kind of joint venture structures. In Europe, you see more companies going to Europe, expanding, but also having more local joint ventures and agreements.
That's what I see. I see both. I would say in the US it will be very limited with respect to direct investments, and there's a very high risk in that as well, but all the companies I've talked to, they have a plan B and a plan C, because you never know what happens after the next elections.
Brilliant. With this, Wolfgang, I really want to appreciate you taking your time out here. Really good to see you again here in China this time. And yeah, I want to thank you all for listening in. My name is Simon from Battery Associates. Please tune in, another Battery Insiders episodes coming out. And yeah, for now, thanks so much, Wolfgang.
Thanks a lot, Simon.